a day. Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
This is a special Milken edition of Wall Street Week coming from Beverly Hills. One of the subjects of this year's Milken conference was how investors respond to an increasingly fractious world. We hosted a panel of major chief investment officers, including from Bridgewater and Temasek. And we start with Karen Carneal-Tambor on how geopolitics may be driving the move toward industrial policy.
I think we've gone to a world where it almost seems desirable to people to see lack of convergence, to see divergence. You talk to businesses and, there's the ups and downs every day of what's happening with the U.S.-China relationship, but they get the direction. They understand that they need to get out of having that much reliance on China, and they're setting up for constantly talking about resilience. Now, what does resilience mean? It basically means you got to double do what you're doing and make it more expensive than it was before, because you weren't in China for no reason. You were in China because it was the cheapest place to be, because that's where you had cheap capital, because that's where you could set up most efficiently. So to go set up a double do, to go create resilience such that if there's a problem, you have a different way of getting your goods or creating them, that's expensive. So I think the biggest implication for investors is that we were kind of in this world where there was like almost a gravitational pull, like all else equal, of inflation to, 0, 1%. And that kind of underpinned a lot of the investment landscape, because it meant that central banks could always be easier than usual because they didn't really have any tension. If there's no inflation, you might as well just be as easy as you can at all times. What's the downside? There's no inflation. And this shift in geopolitics has been one of the really important drivers, kind of smacking us out of that world to a new era where the gravitational pull of inflation is higher, maybe to more like 2%, not a disastrous number, but one where that tension actually starts existing, because you have all this structural spending that people feel they have to do, whatever the price. Some of that is just remilitarization. Without some of these geopolitical pressures, you wouldn't have that. But countries around the world are basically saying, I need to spend more on military activities. Some of it is corporates spending on redoing their supply chain. And the third type I'd mention is everything you're seeing in industrial policy. Officially, it's doing something else. For example, the IRA is going after climate. But I don't believe that spending would have been there without that backdrop of geopolitical competition, and that sense that if China is willing to spend so much state money going after their strategic goals, why aren't we?
Karen, Bridgewater has been thought of in terms of China for some time. You have a long history there. And when you were talking about Asia, I don't think you mentioned India. So I'm curious about China with respect to India, and for that matter, other places like Vietnam and Indonesia, as foreign direct investment has seemed to fall in China. How do you assess India as an alternative to China, and for that matter, Indonesia, other Asian countries?
I think India is fascinating. It is still meaningfully smaller than China, as just kind of what the markets are like, and more difficult than China to transact in. So if you look at China, 7 years ago or something, it was very difficult for a global player to practically be in China. And so even if you weren't worried at all about geopolitics, about them confiscating your assets or anything, just logistically, the question of how do you buy a bond or how do you buy a stock was a challenging one to work through. And